The man I'm introducing to you, Paul Fussell, is John DeWitt Professor of English Literature at Rutgers University. He has also taught at Connecticut College and the University of Heidelberg, and in recent years he has lectured extensively at colleges, universities, and institutes here and abroad. His published writings, besides articles in various scholarly journals, include 5 books: Theory of Prosody in 18th Century England, The Rhetorical World of Augustan Humanism, Poetic Meter and Poetic Form, Samuel Johnson and the Life of Dryden, and The Great War and Modern Memory, which won the 1976 National Book Critics Circle Award for Criticism. He has co-edited a leading anthology of 18th century English literature. He is a member of the Executive Council of the Modern Language Association. As a member of the graduate faculty at Rutgers, he has directed I don't know how many dissertations. One of them was mine, which is what I am including. All of this sounds like the vita of a distinguished academic teacher and critic, and it is. But Professor Fussell is something rarer, and in my view more valuable than a professional academic, even a distinguished one. He is a professional writer, or, to give him a somewhat old-fashioned name, a man of letters. What makes him officially a man of letters, I suppose, is that he serves as a contributing editor of Harper's and as a regular writer for the New Republic. What makes him essentially a man of letters is the range of his writing, the stance that he takes in it, and the sheer quality of the product. One way to suggest the range of Professor Fussell's writing is to note that he has written with equal distinction on 18th century English verse styles and on trench maneuvers in World War I. He has investigated the practical applications of what literary critics call genre theory, and he has reviewed, in the New Republic last summer, the latest edition of the Boy Scout Manual. Professor Fussell's writing covers such wide ground because of his conviction that hardly any artifact of human experience or human imagination is beneath notice. In his forthcoming book on 20th century travel and travel literature, even the baggage ticket and the passport photo receive their share of attention. In The Great War and Modern Memory, there is a superb discussion of the form letter as a contemporary institution. Documents like these, he argues, are both products of and influences upon our imaginative habits. Like literary works, they both reflect our experience and give it form. We invent them to serve some particular need, but once invented, they stay in our minds, they enter into our patterns of thinking, and they produce new needs and new behaviors that their inventors could never have dreamed of. Professor Fussell brings to this argument the training and experience of a sophisticated literary critic, but he differs from even the best of academic critics in the range of documents he is willing to attend to, and in the range of knowledge he brings to bear on them. If The Great War and Modern Memory is a work of literary criticism, it is almost equally a work of history. The forthcoming book on travel is at once literary criticism and sociology, and both are also works of cultural criticism in the tradition of writers like Herbert Reed, George Orwell, and Edmund Wilson. Finally, it would be pleasant to dwell for a while on the quality of Professor Fussell's writing. I won't embarrass him by doing so, however. I'll just note that besides winning the National Book Critics Circle Award for Criticism, The Great War and Modern Memory also won the 1976 National Book Award for Arts and Letters. And I'll cite one bit of my own experience. I've read all but the first of Professor Fussell's books, and while I began them for various reasons, I always finished them for the same reason. I could not put them down. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Fussell.
Thank you very much, Bill. That's a generous introduction. I appreciate it. I'm going to talk about the relation of experience to language in the widest sense. And I'm also going to talk about the operations of individual human memory in contriving a plausible past for each one of us, as well as contriving a national and a world past that makes sense to us. My epigraph tonight is by the American novelist Wright Morris, whom I once heard say, anything processed by memory is fiction. Anything processed by memory is fiction. This reminds me of a recent conversation I had with a friend of mine who fought, as I did, in the Second World War, and who, like me, had had the ambition for many years of writing a personal memoir about his experiences in that war. He had carefully saved all the documents that would be appropriate to such a memoir, his letters home, various maps, field orders, company reports, all the documentation. But he told me a year or two ago that when he went back to consult his carton of documents, that he found he could not write the memoir because, as he said, the documents were all wrong. They were all wrong. They delivered a very different war from the one his memory had contrived. So with those things in mind, let me start by saying that a very interesting subject to me is the artistic character and potential of kinds of writing which are generally considered non-literary or sub-literary, by which I suppose we mean non-fictional or sub-fictional. I have in mind things as ordinary and conventionalized as letters and speeches and legal arguments, as well as more grandiose kinds of writing like military orders of the day and the inscriptions on memorials and tombstones. At our moment, artistic potential tends to be assigned only to writings in which the element of fiction is gross, open, and palpable. I think there's a great deal more to be said about the potential for high art in literary forms in which the fictional or artistic element is subtly entangled with filaments reaching out to fasten upon what we call fact. Now, chief among these alleged non-creative forms of writing is the memoir, and this is the form I want to talk about for a moment. About this problematic literary form, questions like these naturally arise. For example, what is it that differentiates what we call a memoir from what we call a first novel? In this country, at least, a first novel is almost always autobiographical and almost always written in the first person. This question arises with a book like Frank Conroy's Stop Time. The elements comprising this book appeared first as identifiable short stories, but when they were accumulated to make a book, the book presented itself as a memoir. I wonder if it's merely the whim of the bookseller or of the Dewey Decimal Classifier that determines whether a given book shall be displayed on the fiction table or on the autobiography table. I wonder if it would be only verbal playing around to suggest that a so-called first novel is really a memoir written by a young person, while a so-called memoir tends to be a last novel written by an old person. Another question arises naturally about memoir. Why has memoir not been accorded the status enjoyed by so-called works of art? In other words, why have its imaginative figurations and structural inventions not earned the attention of serious criticism? Speaking of J.R. Ackerley's brilliant memoir, My Father and Myself, the British critic Michael Holroyd has said, "For many years now, the art of autobiography has been stranded in a no-man's land between history and biography, which are thought of as more important, and novels and poetry, which are considered more creative," with quotes around that word. He goes on to say, "It's to be hoped that My Father and Myself, besides making for itself a permanent place in literature, will help remedy this ridiculous state of affairs by turning the attention of readers and publishers back to this neglected art form." But if we turn to Anatomy of Criticism, we find that Northrop Frye does not classify this art form as a form of literature. And Virginia Woolf is only one among many sophisticated literary intelligences to find that the domain of art and that of factual testimony are distinct. As she says, truth of fact and truth of fiction are incompatible. Now, it's my business tonight to argue the opposite, that they are compatible. At the extremes of each end of that scheme, fact and fiction, where we know for certain what fact is and what fiction is, her formulation might make sense. The problem is we never know. It doesn't seem valid when we find ourselves at what Nabokov has called that delicate meeting place between imagination and knowledge, which is where we exist most of the time. That delicate meeting place between imagination and knowledge, a point that is intrinsically artistic. That is, that point where we recognize things by imposing on them some prior intellectual or artistic paradigm, so that fiction, attaching to the paradigm, encounters data, and we end up with an imaginative construction of the world, which we call the act of seeing, or the act of perceiving. Ezra Pound once said that every art consists of a fixed element and a variable. If we think of memoir in this sense, we can say that in memoir the presumed basis in fact can be conceived as the fixed element, whereas the devices of fiction are the variable. Or if one wants to relate this concept to critical history, we can say that fact is the province of what Coleridge calls the particular, whereas fictional form in any kind of memory is the dimension of Coleridge's universal. Or to go back further, the one is what Aristotle calls history, that is what happened. The other is what he calls poetry, or plot, that is what happens significantly. So we can say that generically, memoir is in the position of mediating like Coleridge's secondary imagination. It mediates between extremes of two kinds of literary forms, between annals and diaries on the one hand, which are episodic forms in which plot is impossible, because while one is writing, one doesn't know the outcome of the action, and on the other hand, myth. Myth is the narrative form in which plot becomes not merely essential, but egregious and finally symbolic. It seems to me exactly the peculiar privilege of of memoir as a genre to make compatible these two extremes, that is, Woolf's truth of fact and her truth of fiction, which is to say that it's the office of memoir to bring serial time, which contains only stories, under the dominion of memory, which contrives plots. As Thomas Hobbes perceived in the late 17th century, imagination and memory are but one thing, which for divers considerations hath divers names, which is a way of saying what Wright Morris says. Anything processed by memory is fiction, and one lives happiest by recognizing the fact. But general theory of memoir, which we could go on with for hours, is too large a topic for us right now. I want to inquire further into these principles by examining a subgenre of memoir that interests me. That genre that Anthony Pohl's character, Odo Stevens, calls that dicey art form, the war reminiscence. If we should find that war memoirs are much more fictional than is commonly supposed, we might be tempted to revise our habits of historiography. We might be tempted to look at written history in a different way and to give it a different kind of credit from the kind we normally give it. I want to look especially at two of the classical war memoirs emanating from the British Great War. Robert Graves's Goodbye to All That, Edmund Blunden's Undertones of War, both written and published in the late 1920s. Now, the challenge facing each of these authors as he sat down to try to deliver the truth about his experience in the First World War can be illuminated by a remark made in our own time by Kurt Vonnegut, who speaks of the problems of writing about events in the Second World War. As you remember, Kurt Vonnegut experienced the bizarre bombing of the city of Dresden. He had something to write about. He had something to tell us about. But he says, when I got home from the war, I thought it would be easy to write about the destruction of Dresden, since all I would have to do would be to report what I had seen. But the principle he discovered was that this kind of factual testimony is impossible without an artistic scheme. And the artistic scheme that would allow him to testify about what he'd seen in Dresden took him 25 years to devise. The problem was not at all the problem of remembering. The problem was how to make a shapely memory out of one's remembering. As he says, not many words about Dresden came from my mind just after the war. Not enough of them to make a book, anyway. His words, to make a book, are memorable because there's the difficulty. That was the difficulty encountered by these memoirists of the Great War, too, each of whom found that to testify about the war at all, he had to do so under the aegis of a scheme deriving from art, which is to say that to bring home the truth about any sort of serious event, especially one so traumatic as the First World War, one had to employ the carriage of fiction. Now let me illustrate by talking for a moment about flowers. Nobody walking around Flanders and Picardy in France, whether in 1914 or 1980, can fail to observe the variety and profusion of flora there. He will see cherry trees and other fruit trees in blossom, marguerites, bright blue cornflowers, daffodils, jonquils, broom, hawthorn, lily of the valley, columbine, bluebells, all of these in great profusion. And he will also see here and there red roses and bright red poppies. The question we have to ask is this: why, with all these data actually before them, do men testifying about what they saw in France in the First World War notice only the roses and the poppies? They don't talk about cornflowers. They don't talk about daisies. The answer, I think, is that roses were indispensable to the work of the symbolizing imagination during and after that war, not so much because Belgium and France were literally full of them, but because English poetry was full of them. If you go through a standard collection like the Oxford Book of English Verse and count the poems carefully, you will notice that 1/3 of the poems involve roses. 1/3 of the poems are about roses in some way. These writers noticed the roses, or tell us that they noticed the roses also, because since the Middle Ages, in the British tradition, roses had connoted not just England, as in the Wars of the Roses, they'd connoted loyalty and sacrifice as well. The roses observed by the British eye in France during the war somehow belong not to her, but rather to England. One man, Philip Gibbs, writing a memoir called Now It Can Be Told in 1920, writes this. He says, life was good out of the line that September. It was good to go into the garden of a French chateau and pluck a rose and smell its sweetness and think back to England where other roses me blooming. And then he says, England. That's what the rose means. The rose also became indispensable to popular wartime sentimental texts, all the way from the great Fritz Kreisler violin solo, which some of you doubtless remember, Roses of Picardy, to the song that Wilfred Owen calls the favorite song of the troops, which goes, the roses round the door makes me love mother more. He reports that they sing this everlastingly. Even they had an instinct for the relation of the rose and English literary tradition. Crimson roses are especially useful for the literary imagination. Crimson roses, symbolizing sacrificial love, occupy the center of one anecdote which we're actually asked to believe represents factual testimony, although we perceive immediately that the anecdote is really made out of elements of folk tale. The speaker here is a man named Stephen Graham, and he's telling a story which he asks us to believe is true. A British sergeant, he tells us, was shot by sentries on his own side when, in violation of orders, he went forward to fraternize with the enemy on Christmas Day, 1915. Sentries on both sides of the line had been ordered to kill anyone trying to reenact the famous Christmas truce of the year before. This sergeant, Graham tells us, is buried, and these are now his words, is buried in a little old cemetery by the side of the road. From his grave is growing, and we suddenly realize that we're in the presence less of fact than of fiction, here, classical English literature. From his grave is growing, he tells us, a tall rose tree with crimson roses blooming even in autumn. Chaucer or Spenser or Shakespeare couldn't imagine it more authentically, by which I mean more literarily. He goes on to tell us that the roses growing out of this one man's grave are especially noticeable because, as he says, beside this sergeant lies another man who was both captain and knight, with only a dock, a particularly ugly weed, rising from his feet. Indeed, we are told on all the graves of this cemetery are weeds, except on that of the man who gave his life to shake hands on Christmas Day. Now, despite their actual conspicuousness in French cemeteries, blue cornflowers are useless if an effect like that is what one is aiming for. Now, the case of the other red flower, inseparable from writings about the First World War, and I refer, of course, to the poppy, is even more complicated and interesting. What's crucial here is the poppy's relation to that sanguine flower inscribed with woe that makes an appearance not just in Lycidas, but in the general tradition of English pastoral elegy. By the time British troops arrived in France and Belgium in 1914, poppies had already accumulated a ripe traditional symbolism in English writing, where they'd been a staple since Chaucer and Spenser and Shakespeare. Their conventional connotation was the blessing of sleep and oblivion, since they're related, of course, to opium. But later in the 19th century, they took on additional overtones of suggestion, those glanced at by W.S. Gilbert of Gilbert and Sullivan, when in his comic opera Patience, he makes his comic hero Bunthorne walk down Piccadilly with a poppy or a lily in his medieval hand. That is to say, poppies now, in the late 19th century, began to be one of the properties of aestheticism and of its frequent attendant, homoerotic passion, either real or affected. For half a century before the fortuitous publicity achieved by the poppies of Flanders, this association with homoeroticism had been conventional in England, in works by Oscar Wilde, Lord Alfred Douglas, the Victorian painter Simeon Solomon, John Addington Symonds, and countless others. Thus, to all the poppy poems of the First World War, like John McCrae's In Flanders Fields, where you remember the poppies grow between the crosses, row on row, and so on, as well as Isaac Rosenberg's Break of Day in the Trenches, to all these poems exploiting poppies as memorial emblems, adheres a trace of the meaning of Victorian poppies as the fittest emblems for elegizing the journey into oblivion of beautiful young males. You may remember McCrae's poem and some of its details, his poem In Flanders Fields. Short days ago, his youths, who are now pushing up poppies, he tells us, loved and were loved. He's careful to enter that detail. And Isaac Rosenberg, while wearing a poppy behind his own ear in the presumed act of speaking the poem, thinks about the dead soldiers, but what he thinks about are their homoerotic attributes. He thinks about strong eyes, fine limbs, all of the attractive attributes of what he calls haughty athletes. I think one of the neatest turns in popular symbolism, and if you'll think about it, you realize that popular symbolism is always right. It's always right because it's validated by everyone. One of the neatest turns in popular symbolism is that by which the paper poppies still sold on the streets of London for the benefit of the British Legion on Armistice Day can be conceived as symbols at once of oblivion and remembrance. They betoken for the literary mind this paradox, oblivion, remembrance. They betoken for the dead a happy oblivion of their agony and waste, and at the same time they symbolize for the living an unprecedented remembrance of their loss. We can say that these little paper simulacra come originally from British pastoral elegy. They pass through Victorian and Edwardian male sentimental poetry. They go over to Flanders to flesh themselves out in the actual blossoms during the war. Then they return to be worn in buttonholes on Remembrance Day. Now a word about birds. Just as only those flowers are noticed in France which have achieved prior artistic and symbolic weight, so with birds. Out of the hundreds of species of birds available for notice in France, only 2 prove suitable to enter what proclaims itself to be factual testimony. These 2 birds you will have guessed already. They are the lark and the nightingale. These 2 birds are noticed because they have already demonstrated their success as literary properties in English pastoral and aubade. Aubade, you remember, is that conventional kind of poem sung by one lover to another in the morning when the lovers have to part. The standard form of the aubade has the woman saying, "That was the nightingale, that bird that just sang," and the young man says, "No, you're wrong, it was the lark." The young man is risking his life by being with the woman. She wants the night to go on forever. He knows it's got to stop. She chooses to hear the nightingale, he the lark. Well, these 2 birds have been playing out their polar symbolism in English aubades for hundreds of years. One example is Juliet saying it was the nightingale and not the lark to Romeo. It's the same we gather with the troops in the trenches. They tell us only larks and nightingales. They hear larks at the morning ceremony of Stand To. They hear nightingales at the evening counterpart of that ceremony. In the same way, the nightingale enters experience from literature to serve as the ironic bird of darkness, just as the lark enters experience from literature to serve as the delightful bird of dawn and promise and hope and safety. Siegfried Sassoon writes, recalling a moment in spring 1918, he writes, "Nightingales were singing beautifully, but the sky winked and glowed with swift flashes of the distant bombardments, and there was a faint rumbling, low and menacing." And then he adds, "And still the nightingales sang on." And he concludes by saying, sardonically, "O world God made." Now let me turn for a moment to talk about Robert Graves' classic memoir, The First World War, Goodbye to All That. The device of art that presides over this book, which we're asked to believe constitutes memories of the First World War, the device of art presiding over this book is the paradigm of farce, or even comedy of humors. Graves was a very, and still is, extremely intelligent and perceptive literary sensibility. And his sharp eye and impulsive literary intelligence told him very early that the Army is like a theater in which a comedy of humors is playing a perpetual run. For example, the Army offers a number of generically rigid type characters, which are the same now as they were in Shakespeare's or Chaucer's day. We have the hapless private, the vainglorious corporal, mad with a little authority, the sadistic sergeant, the adolescent snob lieutenant, the fire-eating major, the doughty colonel, the crazed brigadier. Like theatrical characters, all these are costumed conventionally. That is, you know the person wholly from his outside appearance, the way you know the characters in Commedia dell'arte, because they represent themselves conventionally. And like theatrical characters, these grades, these military grades, are to be known only externally by gestures and lines. Randall Jarrell gets it exactly right when he says that Graves is the true heir of Ben Jonson, the great English master of comedy of humors involving type characters of this kind. We will be astonished then to be told by one of Graves's explicators, the British critic J.M. Cohen, that Goodbye to All That is, as he says, harshly actual, that it is, again quoting him, the work of a man who is not trying to create an effect, that it is, in short, as he says, a direct and factual autobiography. Actually, it's not a direct and factual autobiography at all. It is rather a satire, which exposes 90% of its characters as either knaves or fools, and which is built out of anecdotes bearing the profound impress of the techniques of comic writing for the stage. The brilliance and compelling energy of this book, and you can test this by its being eminently readable. One never gets sick of that book because it has a certain internal energy that's inexhaustible by a reader. The brilliance and compelling energy of this book reside precisely in its invention of comic plots, in its constant resourcefulness in imposing the patterns, the prior patterns of farce and comedy of humors onto the blank horrors or meaningless vacancies of actual experience. If it were really something like a documentary transcription of the actual, as Cohen suggests, it would really be worth very little and would surely not be, as it is, infinitely rereadable. It's valuable just because it's not true in that way. Now, the artistic form, or to use some terms I've used before, plot, which Graves lays over the unshaped stream of experience, or what I've called story, life being without plot, life consisting merely of serial events. The artistic form that he lays over the materials of so-called life is that of the brief theatrical sketch, or as he puts it, the caricature scene. Those are his own words, the caricature scene. His scenes are theatrical because they present type characters it's presented in dialogue. Many of Graves's playlets in this book have all the black and white immediacy of cartoons with captions. And indeed, his skill at writing pithy lines will suggest the dynamics of the standard two-line caption under a cartoon in the old Punch magazine. It's a model that Graves has always had before him. For example, as late as 1955, ridiculing William Butler Yeats's shrewd irrationalism, he dramatizes Yeats's reliance on his wife as a spirit medium whose maunderings can be turned into saleable poems. And Graves contrives this little dialogue. Undergraduate who meets Yeats walking across some academic common. Undergraduate says, "Have you written any poems recently, sir?" And Yeats answers, "No, my wife has been feeling poorly and disinclined." You can see it as on a stage. It's followed by a blackout immediately, and you can hear the burst of laughter it occasions. Well, whatever materials they embody, the effect of these character scenes of Graves is farcical, and they rely on a number of techniques associated with comic writing for the theater. That is, some depend upon astonishing coincidences. Some deploy the device of climactic multiple endings. The audience, that is, thinks the joke is over and is then given one or sometimes two even funnier lines. Some expose, as comic writing always does, the disparity between the expected and the actual. Some, like music hall sketches, present comic encounters between type representatives of widely disparate social classes, always good for a laugh. Some involve the main characters not knowing some crucial fact, and some, more melodramatic, depict rescues or salvations in the nick of time. All operate by offering the audience a succession of little ironies and surprises. A typical scene, which some of you may remember with delight, is the one of the grave judicial inquiry into the excrement deposited by Private 99 Davies on the Barrack Square at Wrexham. It's a perfect Ben Johnsonian comic scene, with each man in his humor, all ready to be staged by a cast of 6. It's done wholly in dialogue. And we're even given stage directions by Graves, like off stage and pause and in a nervous sing-song. Well, here's another example, this one fusing the traditions of stage farce with the traditions of the Punch cartoon. Here, 2 men appear before the adjutant to report that they've just shot their company sergeant major. The adjutant said, "Good heavens, how did that happen?" "It was an accident, sir." "What do you mean, you damn fools? Did you mistake him for a spy?" "No, sir, we mistook him for our platoon sergeant." Hardly the work, I think we can agree, of a writer who is, in Cohen's words, not trying to create an effect. Graves is trying to do nothing but. If more emergent occasions, like the absurd and murderous attack at Lewes, begin as farce, they end in something close to grand guignol. Even Graves's anticipation of his feared mental breakdown at the front, he sees in theatrical terms, that is, from the outside. He imagines how it will look to spectators. He says, "It would be a general nervous collapse with tears and twitchings and dirtied trousers. I had seen cases like that." Notice he doesn't talk at all about what it would feel like. It's what it would look like that's important. The critic Cohen notes Graves's concern with accurate documentation in this book, and he is right if he means that Graves presents a number of documents and transcribes them accurately. But you don't have to read very far in this book to notice that there's something odd about all these documents. They're remarkably inept, fatuous, or erroneous. In this book, documents of all kinds, the normal materials of a sometimes too trusting historiography, are exposed in all their dubiousness and complexity. Almost every one of these documents, even Siegfried Sassoon's great pacifistic statement called A Soldier's Declaration, almost every one of them betrays some dissociation from actuality or some fatal error in assumption or conclusion. To put it bluntly, the documents don't seem to know what's going on. For example, there's the catechistic history book of Graves's childhood, which he quotes. That book, he remembers, begins, question, "Why are the Britons so called?" Answer, because they painted themselves blue. Next question. Then there are the wartime propaganda news clippings about the priests at Antwerp hung upside down by the Huns as human clappers in their own church bells. There's the laughable Lewes attack order. There's the colonel's letter deposing not merely that Robert Graves is dead, but asserting furthermore that he was very gallant. Both of them lies. There's the erroneous casualty list with Graves's name among the dead, and the fatuous, memorable letter of the Little Mother, which argues that the bereaved mothers of England like the war so much, since it's enabled them to offer their sons as sacrifices, that the war must continue at all costs. There's even the record of a farcical mistransmission in Morse code that sends a battalion to Cork when it's supposed to go to York. Somebody's got the wrong letter, you see. Then there's the autograph collector's disoriented letter to Thomas Hardy, which begins, "Dear Mr. Hardy, I'm interested to know why the devil you don't reply to my request." There are the lunatic examination papers written by 3 of Graves's students at the University of Cairo. And in a new epilogue written for the 1957 revision of this book, Graves tells us that one reason he was suspected of being a German spy while he was harboring in South Devon during the Second War is that someone made a silly, lying document out of a squash in his garden by inscribing the words Heil Hitler on it. Well, the point of all these is not just the obvious point, that is, humankind's immense and touching liability to error, folly, and psychosis. The point is also the near impossibility of a rational or even a very clear-sighted historiography. Because the documents on which a work of history might be based prove to be so mistaken, or so loathsome, or so silly, or so downright mad, that no one could get through them without coming badly unhinged. From Graves, let me turn for a moment to Edmund Blunden, author of Undertones of War, and let's inquire about what is intervening between his perception of the so-called facts and his rendering of those facts in his own writing. He is another whose literary behavior would seem to imply his discovery that without a high degree of art, there can be no factual testimony. Although his book Undertones of War has been designated by some critics as a true memoir, it's actually as far from the literal as any other personal account of the First World War. The presiding figure to which everything yields in this book is that of English literary pastoral. What complicates Blunden's factual recall of the events of the war is his conviction that the rural countryside is virtually identical with literature. And I'd like to propose this, by the way, as one of the great imaginative acts of the last 60 or 70 years. Blunden once wrote a book called Nature in English Literature. Now, that's obvious enough, and it's not a very good book. But I can easily imagine him writing a companion book titled English Literature in Nature. Indeed, that could be a subtitle to his Undertones of War. To Blunden, both the countryside and literature are alive, and both have feelings, as we say. Both are menaced by the war. For the countryside of France to be brutally torn by shells is a scandal close to murder. It's a catastrophe for Blunden, bordering on the burning of libraries. The naiads and hamadryads, and those are Blunden's terms, that he conceives lurking in the as yet unravished countryside west of the Somme in 1918, are actual to him, More actual, perhaps, than to Milton were the nymphs of Il Penseroso, whose woodland haunts are threatened there by the rude axe. The French streams and woods of Blunden's timorous spirits are in the path of the great German counterattack of March 1918, and it's their fate, and not at all his own, as well as the fate of pastoral poetry and of all literature and of all civility, that prompts him to utter this bitter conclusion. I might have known the war by this time, but I was still too young to know its depth of ironic cruelty. The way Blunden proceeds in this book is to enforce an ironic juxtaposition between the facts of daily action at the front and the images of English literary pastoral. And some of these juxtapositions are so subtle that we rub our eyes in wonder and admiration, like the one in the hated general's criticism of a lieutenant's written account of a patrol. The general returns the report with contempt and writes on it, "Too flowery for a military report." One suspects that almost always in this book, actuality is being made to yield to the demands of Blunden's gently ironic pastoral art. Can we believe, for example, that before the war his orderly was actually a gardener who now in moments of crisis and danger comforts himself by singing aloud the popular song, "You must sprinkle me with kisses if you want my love to grow"? Now let me conclude with some remarks about the dependence of memory upon various forms and patterns and paradigms which are foreign to actuality. To report what has happened, obviously, one has to remember it. And to remember it, one has to be assisted by some form of mnemonic. From the most literal entries that we might make in a diary or on a calendar, to the most fugitive triggers of memory, like smells and tastes, like, say, the taste of a petite madeleine dipped in tea. Most mnemonics, we realize when we think about it, most mnemonics are intellectual schemes or metaphors, like the image of chronology, which belongs in here and not out there. The image of chronology or the figure of causality. These are schemes that inhere not in nature, not in the world of fact or data, but rather in mind, in the world of fiction or plot or significant cause. Without such schemes, narrative recall cannot take place. Such schemes derive not from the world of actual occurrence, which is the domain of story, that is, mere serial event, or the domain of fact, but from the world of idea, which is the domain of plot or the world of art. Now, the figure of plot, which most often assists factual testimony about wartime events, or indeed about any traumatic events, including airplane accidents, auto accidents, earthquakes, typhoons, tornadoes, and so on, is the figure of irony of situation. Let me give you an example. I'll refer to some writing by a completely unknown person named Charles Bricknell, who was a gunner, that is, an enlisted man in an artillery battery in the First World War. In writing about what he remembers from the war, he behaves as if his understanding of the irony which the mind is attached to events is what enables him to recall them at all many years later. He was in an artillery battery which was once being relieved by a new unit fresh from England, which had never been on the line before. And he writes, "There was a long road leading to the front line which the Germans occasionally shelled, and the shells used to drop plonk in the middle of it." In other words, the Germans had this obvious road taped, and the trick was to stay off it. This new unit, he says, assembled right on this road, ready to go into action in the night. What now rises to the surface of Charles Bricknell's memory is material he needs in order to shape up this memory into something truly memorable. That is, an ironic component. So what he now remembers is the hopes and illusions of these newcomers. He says, they was all spick and span, buttons polished, and all the rest of it. Indeed, they're so new and sweet and trusting that he tries to help them. He says, we spoke to a few of the chaps before going up and told them about the Germans shelling the road, but of course they was not in charge, so up they went, and the result was they all got blown up. Now, contemplating what he has now made into an ironic plot, Bricknell is moved to an almost Dickensian reiterative rhetoric. He says, ho, what a disaster. We had to go shooting lame horses, putting the dead to the side of the road. What a disaster, which could have been avoided if only the officers had gone into action the hard way, that is, overland. And he adds, that was something I shall never forget. Now, it's the if only rather than the slaughter that helps Bricknell never forget this scene. A slaughter by itself is too commonplace to be recalled. It's only when an ironic plot can be seen to be suitable to its interpretation that it persists in the memory. In gathering material for his book called The First Day on the Somme, Martin Middlebrook, British historian and journalist, interviewed as many of the survivors, now of course pressing 80 years old, as he could find, and he asked them one crucial question. He said, what is your strongest recollection of the war? What's notable is the way these veterans use the mnemonic of irony of situation to achieve what they call their strongest recollections. One man, for example, says, my strongest recollection, all those grand-looking cavalrymen ready-mounted to follow the breakthrough. And he adds, what a hope. And another says, one's revulsion to the ghastly horrors of war was submerged in the belief that this war was to end all wars and utopia arise. And then he comments, what an illusion. But ironies of situation like that do not always transmit skeptical news. Testifying about the appearance of the battlefields of the Somme after the attacks of 1916, John Masefield, the poet at the moment acting as a government propagandist, asserts, and when he asserts this, he clearly expects to be believed, he asserts that he came upon the body of an English soldier, beside which a pocket Bible happened to be lying open. And not merely lying open, but lying open precisely at the 89th Psalm. And not merely lying open at that psalm, but exhibiting the text of that psalm in such a way that, quote, the only legible words were, thou hast broken down all his hedges, thou hast brought his strongholds to ruin. Now, Masefield has no doubts that he will be believed. He is not consciously telling lies, and the reader is not reading that as if it were a fiction. He's reading it as if it were a fact. The reader requires the fiction to accept it as a usable fact. Masefield knows, in short, that readers will demand of any kind of factual narrative that it be all but indistinguishable from the most calculated art. Otherwise, the writer or the speaker will not be read or will not be listened to. Now, in his way, Masefield seems wiser than many later literary commentators who seem sometimes too literally to embrace the illusionistic claim of memoir to lie at the center of the literature of fact. It's a sobering thought, I think, that memoirs of the kind I've been focusing on here have been used as fundamental materials for the writing of history. We might be led to the conclusion, if we were skeptical, that there can be no history. There can be only literary history. For after all, our access to historical events, even so significant an event as the First World War, must be through the makers of plots, that is, what Aristotle calls poets. As one critic has observed, our evidence for what we call history is itself verbal. A document, a memoir, a charter are all semantic acts whose correspondence with actuality, that is, whose truth function, is no greater than that of other verbal modes. We are thus in a predicament as imaginations trying to understand what's going on. We are suspended between fact on the one hand and art on the other, and we're prevented by each from ever wholly understanding the other. Our predicament is implied with perhaps a deceptive levity by a very great critic, Oscar Wilde, who in his critical dialogue, The Critic as Artist, presents two characters. One is very well named as Ernest, the other is called Gilbert. After discussing this paradox that I've been developing for you tonight, the well-named Ernest asks this question: life then is a failure? And Gilbert answers, from the artistic point of view, certainly. Thank you.